очень долго, ну как бы, We are online, and you have the earphones. Добрый день, уважаемые.
Good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen. We have held the first stage of our negotiations, the most important one, certainly the relations between Russia and the UK, to put it mildly, leave much to be desired. They are at the lowest level over many years, and this is not our fault. I'm not going to dwell on that, but I would like to point out that we are in favor of normalizing our relations. We're in favor of improving them. We want them to pursue a constructive path, and this is only possible on the basis of such principles as equality, respect for the interests of one another, due regard for these interests, whereas cherry-picking, trying to impose some ultimatums or threats, well, this is a way that leads nowhere. Our relations need to be a two-way street. I would like to say that if we act guided by our national interests, thinking that we need to get some added value from these contacts, then we have something to work with, such as stable indicators of trade. In January, November 2021, it was at the level analogous to 2020. It was more than $24 billion, whereas the business cycles of Russia and the UK continue mutually beneficial practical cooperation, trying to find additional ways to invest resources and money in a mutually beneficial manner. Of course, these positive trends could be facilitated if we resumed as soon as possible the activities of the Intergovernmental Committee on Trade and Investment, as well as the high-level energy dialogue, and Russia is ready for the resumption of such activities. There is another positive example, namely the dynamics of our cultural and humanitarian ties, which are based upon long-standing resilient traditions. In 2019-2020, we successfully held the events of the Russia-UK Cross-Year of Music, whereas we have scheduled the Cross-Year of Knowledge for 2022-2023. We most certainly support such contacts between the civil society of our two countries. But so far, we have not discussed these matters. I do hope that we will have a chance to talk about the bilateral agenda at lunch. We have not yet discussed that because Madam Secretary, from the very outset, well, we've asked her to talk about the priority issues she would like to discuss, and she named Ukraine, Belarus, China, and Iran as these priority issues, and we have spoken in detail about the implementation of the Minsk agreements. These Minsk agreements are not just not implemented by Kiev, they are overtly rejected by the representatives of the Ukrainian regime. We have also spoken about what actions we undertake to persuade those who have influence on the Kiev regime to make Zelensky and his government live up to the commitments that are enshrined in the Minsk agreements and the relevant UN Security Council resolutions. And we have divergences with regard to our interpretation of the Minsk agreements, even though I do not see what other interpretation can be given to these documents, because it's all written, black on white. We have also spoken about our relations with the Republic of Belarus. We've spoken about the preparations for the military exercises that they're gonna kick off very soon in the coming days, and they have suscitated, they brought about a lot of concern in London and elsewhere, even though we do not quite understand what kind of anxiety the stationing of our troops in our territory can bring about. At the request of Madam Secretary, I have told her about our relations with the People's Republic of China. I've also spoken about the recent talks between President Putin and President Xi Jinping in Beijing, I have told her how we are building our ties with China bilaterally and also within regional formats and international organizations purely on such principles as the balance of interest, equality, due regard for the interests of one another. And, you know, there is no leader and no one who is being led or following in the wake of someone else, which is the case in NATO, for instance. Now, as far as Iran is concerned, we agree that there are all the chances to achieve a resumption of the JCPOA in the nearest future, but still a lot needs to be done before that happens. Now, when discussing Ukraine, Madam Secretary has touched upon Russia's initiatives that were set forth in mid-December last year. These initiatives purport to introduce security guarantees in Europe. We have also put forth our approach to subsequent actions, especially with regard to the US, and we have expressed a desire to get some concrete reaction from the West to our proposal and to our request. We have requested that the Western counterparts give their interpretation to the obligations and the commitments that were adopted at the highest level within the OSCE. And these obligations in particular stipulate that no one's security should be reinforced at the expense of others' security. And President Putin has dwelt a lot on these approach to these commitments. He spoke about that during the meeting with President Macron, and he said that we have concerns because we believe that NATO's enlargement could violate the commitments adopted by the OSCE leaders in Astana and in Istanbul, and that is why President Putin has called to search altogether for security approaches that could ensure the security of Ukraine, West, and Russia. I cannot say that we have achieved some common ground with regard to that, but I do hope that our today's talks will give a chance to our British colleagues to have a better understanding of what these problems represent to Russia and how important we find them. I do hope that we will have a chance to talk about our cooperation at the UN Security Council, because both the UK and Russia are permanent members of this most important body of the United Nations, and a very special responsibility is incumbent upon us to take measures to ensure international security as well as international stability. I'm hopeful that we will pay greater attention when we speak about international matters to these tasks, to these objectives that allow us to constructively join our efforts together instead of trying to fuel some artificially fabricated problems that come to dominate our dialogue to the detriment of the real tasks that we need to pursue and resolve in the interests of peace and stability on this planet. Thank you.
Good morning. Minister Lavrov and I have discussed some very serious issues today that have a bearing on the future peace and stability of Europe. As I have said, there is still time for Russia to end its aggression towards Ukraine and pursue the path of diplomacy. But NATO is very clear. If that path is not chosen, there will be severe consequences for Russia, Ukraine, and the whole of Europe. Russia is a country with a rich and deep history. It has extraordinary prowess in fields like science and mathematics. There could be huge opportunities ahead for the people of Russia. However, the aggression by the Russian government and attempts to relitigate the past are seriously undermining Russia's international standing. In particular, the claim that the indivisibility of security means that countries on Russia's borders can't defend themselves or join defensive alliances like NATO simply isn't true. Russia's actions in attempting to destabilise Ukrainian democracy and the ability of Ukrainians to determine their own future, including through hybrid warfare and amassing over 100,000 troops on the border in a threatening manner. These acts have actually had the effect of strengthening NATO's resolve and turning the Ukrainian people further away from Russia. There are also serious implications for energy supplies at a time of rising gas prices. We believe fundamentally in the self-determination of the Ukrainian people. If there were to be a Russia incursion into Ukraine, the Ukrainians will fight. This would be a prolonged and drawn-out conflict. The UK and our allies would put in place severe sanctions targeting individuals and institutions. And the United States have been clear that Nord Stream 2 would not go ahead. But today I'm here to talk about the alternative path that Russia can take. As a fellow permanent member of the Security Council, Russia can stick by its commitments to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity as agreed in the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons. Russia can work through the NATO-Russia Council to improve trust and transparency on issues like forced posture, and NATO have put forward positive proposals which we want to discuss with Russia. And also, we can work together with other P5 nations to stop Iran obtaining a nuclear weapon, which Minister Lavrov and I also discussed. Russia has a choice which can result in a better future for Europe, Russia, and the Russian people. Thank you.
Уважаемые коллеги, переходим к вопросу.
Colleagues, on to the questions. I would like to give the floor to the British media first.
Thank you very much. Foreign Secretary, first a question for you. A few days ago, you posted on social media this. You said about Ukraine, Russia's actions show their claims to have no plans to invade are false. After today's talks, do you still believe that Russia has plans for a further invasion of Ukraine? And a question for Foreign Minister Lavrov. We're increasingly hearing the phrase coercive diplomacy to describe Russia's actions now, this combination of political demands and muscle flexing. Do you believe that coercive diplomacy is working for you? And is this what we can expect from now on? Is this how Russia will be conducting its foreign policy from now on? Thank you.
Well, Steve, the facts speak for themselves. We have seen the amassing of troops and weapons on the Ukrainian border by Russia in a threatening matter. And we've also seen the establishment of cyber warfare and other forms of hybrid warfare to seek to undermine Ukrainian democracy. But why I'm here in Moscow today is that Russia has a very clear choice. They can pursue the path of diplomacy, work with NATO to improve European security, or continue down the path that they have been indicating by amassing troops on the border in a threatening way.
Я теперь, да?
You know, we talked about this in detail today, and frankly, I'm disappointed by the fact that we had a conversation of a deaf with a mute person, as if we listen to, but we do not hear. So our detailed explanations fell on deaf ears. And it's like saying that Russia is waiting for the land to freeze, for tanks to be able to go through the Ukrainian territory. I think that this is the kind of ideas that our British colleagues had, because it felt like facts were going there but not sinking in, because we gave many facts. We gave the most detailed explanations. I did that. President Putin did that. Other representatives of Russia explained the situation, but it feels like our colleagues are not familiar with these detailed explanations, or either this, or they just ignore them altogether. So you just quoted the statement of Madam Secretary that there's no invasion into Ukraine, and these statements are false statements of Russia. But these statements are made not only by the Russian leadership, but also Pentagon says the same. I just read this recently, and there's serious people working there. They have satellites to observe what is going on the land, including what is going on in our Russian land. Same statement I heard from the defense minister of Ukraine. President Zelensky asks everyone not to panic, but it feels like our Western colleagues need President Zelensky only as an instrument, as a tool to tilt the imbalance in Russia. No one cares about what he's saying there and what negative effects this can do to the Ukrainian economy. They don't care that investments outflow from Ukraine, and they evacuate staff of the embassy and citizens of US and the UK are asked to leave Ukraine. So we even thought maybe you plan something in Ukraine if you evacuate your staff. Having a look at your actions, maybe we will also ask our auxiliary staff in our diplomatic missions to leave this place for a while and go home. I don't know what plans our Anglo-Saxon colleagues have. This is lamentable. And we explained in detail today that the Russian troops on the border, Madam Secretary just mentioned this, and London is concerned by that, but this is our own territory. Unlike hundreds of thousands of the UK servicemen in the Baltic countries, but yesterday Boris Johnson said that they need to send the servicemen to Romania and Bulgaria. But we are doing this in our territory, and they say we do this because this is our territory, because this is NATO. But this NATO-centric narrative has been, I think, important to the whole discussion that we had today. This is indoctrinated in the approach of our colleagues towards European security. We try to understand how egoistic is this NATO-centric approach, and when it comes to legitimate concerns of Russia in the area of its own security, and how selectively they interpret their obligations under the OC, obligations on indivisible security. There's a whole package in one para that's about the right of each state to select its own alliances or allies, but at the same time it highlights the obligation of each state not to provide its own security at the cost of other states' security. It highlights the respect for the policy of neutrality. It highlights that it is not acceptable to have situations when the OSCE space is going to have one dominating state, group of states, or an organization. Also, it's not acceptable that there has to be any area of influence in the European territory. Today, we have enumerated multiple examples of such areas of influence established by NATO or European Union, when they state that in the Balkans, Russians have nothing to do there, as well as in Africa. They even nominate an envoy who's going to be in charge of the selective legislation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Is it not an area of influence? Is it not a claim to control all these procedures in the Balkans? I think this is an obvious fact. Of course, we answered questions posed by Secretary about what we do with Belarus, about our plans with Belarus. All of this looks like a unilateral approach based on the belief that the West has the right to claim guarantees in a situation when no one promises us any guarantees. And this is quite an illustrative discussion, and unfortunately it's going to be reproducing the answers that we are awaiting in response to our questions on the indivisible security. And this is going to come from all the OSCE countries, but instead of answers, frank answers from each of the states that we are awaiting, the European Union wants to give a collective document where all the nuances of national positions would be kind of leveled, smoothed out, and then we'll have to figure out how to find a way out of this situation. As for the aspirations of Russia to combine this course of diplomacy that would combine political demands with physical threats, is that the right idea? Did I get it right? No, in fact, we are not going to coerce or enforce anyone. These are the accusations. But complying by asking to comply by the OSCE decisions, we are not enforcing anyone. We stand for diplomacy, but now Western countries, they all learned the word de-escalation. So whatever they say about Russia, they always say, we call for a de-escalation. And also they say, we hope that Russia is going to choose diplomacy. Well, we chose diplomacy. We've been choosing diplomacy for all these years, and we are going to choose diplomacy. As for Istanbul Charter on the European security of 1999, and as for the Astana Declaration of 2010, all of these are products of diplomacy, fruits of diplomacy at the highest level. So if someone tells us, yeah, well, we've coordinated this phrasing that no one is supposed to provide its own security at the cost of others' security, well, is that done for us today to be able to defend the right of each country to choose its alliances? We've been lied to so many times, and President Putin told this in detail. Now they try to lie to us through these obligations that we all had coordinated. We welcomed them in an active manner on the issue of indivisible security within the OSCE. So today there is a package. It had been coordinated, but they select only the right to choose alliances. But obligation not to undermine others' security is being ignored, just like this selective approach dominates in the position of the West on Minsk agreement, not to talk about the position of Kiev. So let's take Minsk agreements. The natural solution of the security problem is ceasefire, amnesty, special status for Donbass, reforms of constitution, decentralization in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk, elections in concert with them and OSCE. And after all this, resumption of control by the Ukrainian authorities along the whole border. So from all this package, they only select the last item. So today when we touched upon this topic with Ms. Secretary, she said, yeah, we need to look at the sequence of steps. What do they mean? So they only pick out the items that are beneficial for the Kiev regime on the resumption of control of the border. But this is only one item from the Minsk agreement. But there are others. And as for other items, Kiev doesn't want to work on this too. And this is in the public statements of Kiev. Same goes for the obligations on the indivisible security. So coordinate everything to smooth everyone's and to smooth their concerns. And then the rest would be ignored as something artificially made up. This approach is not going to work. We don't want to threaten anyone. Have a look at the public statements. you've never heard any threats from us, but we are being threatened. By the way, in the House of Commons, the Secretary said that, and she repeated this today. We heard the threats, and we heard the same during the talks. And same has been aired by the British officials, representatives of the British government. They say, if you do not stop the aggression, what aggression? When did it start? Against whom? They say, then you'll face the toughest consequences that you're going to regret. So these are the kind of things. Have you ever heard anything like that from us? I'm pretty sure you'll never be able to cite any of such examples. So once again, I would like to highlight, we want the spirit of compromise, the spirit of looking for balance and taking into account mutual interest. This is supposed to help us to helped us to sign documents within the OSCE, and I want this spirit of equality to help us with the agreements that have been set in stone and have been enshrined in documents. We want this to become realized and fulfilled. We don't want this to remain lip service. We stand ready for such cooperation. Ria Novosti, please. Good afternoon. I have a question to Foreign Office. Two questions, actually. Can I ask some of our colleagues to switch off their mics? We hear noises. Yes, please continue. There appeared in the public documents called Undermining Russia. It's about financing Russian media and NGOs through British diplomatic missions, BBC and Reuters. Can you confirm that these documents really existed and this project existed? So this was the first question. And if you allow the second question, the UK stated that Russia builds up troops along the Ukrainian border, although this is in Russia, but the British warships in the Black Sea, they've been observed there. Do you not think that these actions of London are aggressive?
There is no doubt that the stationing of over 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border is directly put in place to threaten Ukraine. And this is not the only action that we've seen by the Russian authorities. We've seen cyber attacks and we've seen other attempts to undermine the activities of a sovereign nation, despite the fact that Russia signed up to the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, which agreed to protect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And can I remind you that in the UN purposes and principles, it is very clear that all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force. And I can't see any other reason for having 100,000 troops stationed on the Ukrainian border apart from to threaten Ukraine. And if Russia is serious about diplomacy, they need to move those troops and desist from the threats. Now, if we are able to follow a path of diplomacy, and NATO has put offer on the table for talks to improve transparency, to improve confidence between the parties, then there are hopes of a better future. And what the British Embassy is doing here in Moscow is pursuing closer ties in areas like science, mathematics, and culture. But those closer ties will only result from a better relationship between the United Kingdom and Russia. And I also want to respond to Minister Lavrov's point about indivisible security and the issues that were raised in the OSCE agreements. What it says is that there should be no undermining of another country's security. No one is undermining Russia's security. That is simply not true. And it is perfectly proper for sovereign nations such as Ukraine to defend themselves and to seek defensive alliances. That is part of protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. And on the subject of the Minsk agreements, Russia needs to fully implement the ceasefire, and it needs to remove the heavy weaponry from the region. That has to happen so that we can make progress on the Minsk agreements. Now, I think there is progress to be made. I think there is progress to be made between NATO and Russia on transparency, on discussions around security, and I think there is progress to be made on the Minsk agreements too. But Russia needs to properly engage, and they do need to de-escalate and move the troops away from the border.
Yes, please. Brian Oversteer. I'm sorry, you didn't respond to my question about the warships. And can you also corroborate the authenticity of the documents that were published by Anonymous? Thank you.
In response to Russia's actions and the threatening behaviour of Russia on the Ukrainian border, the United Kingdom is working with our NATO allies to make sure we are strengthening defence. This is purely defensive. NATO is a defensive alliance, and that is absolutely the right approach to take. But it would be better if Russia were to de-escalate and these responses weren't necessary. But we have to make sure that we are working with our NATO allies and we are standing by our security agreements. I've already responded on your points about the documents. Our embassy works in good faith with institutions across Russia to strengthen our relationship in areas from culture to mathematics to science. And that's what we want to do. But it is proving very difficult in an environment where Russia is actively threatening a sovereign nation.
Diana, Nine News, if I can. Foreign Secretary, the Foreign Minister just characterised these talks as...
Should you announce?
They don't introduce themselves?
No.
But we have...
Very sorry. Could we come to Tom Parfitt of The Times, please?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. A question first for Foreign Secretary Liz Truss, please. President Macron of France said this week that President Putin had committed to not launch any new military initiatives regarding Ukraine, and French officials indicated that there were signs that Russia was moving towards some kind of de-escalation. Have you received any kind of similar assurance? Do you see any evidence at all of some kind of Russian de-escalation, or have some of your European colleagues got the wrong end of the stick? And if I may as well, a question for Minister Lavrov. Minister Lavrov, were there any concessions or assurances that you received from Foreign Secretary Truss today regarding Russia's central concern over NATO enlargement? Thank you.
Minister Lavrov has said to me today that Russia have no plans to invade Ukraine. But we need to see those words followed up by actions, and we need to see the troops and the equipment that is stationed on the Ukrainian border moved elsewhere, because at present it is in a very threatening posture. And whilst I want to work towards a better outcome, it's vitally important that the UK and its NATO allies are prepared for all eventualities. That is why we are providing defensive support to Ukraine. It's why we're working to strengthen support across NATO, and it's why we have put in place a much tougher legislation on sanctions, so we are ready in the event of an incursion. Now, my purpose here in Moscow today is absolutely to avoid that outcome and to work with Russia to make sure that we move ahead on talks with NATO. But that cannot come at the expense of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. And it can't come at the expense of NATO's open door policy.
I can confirm that this is precisely what Madam Secretary has been saying over the 2 hours that we spent behind closed doors. We have not heard any other different tonality. The demand that Russia should move the military that are stationed in the Russian territory, despite our arguments, well, this demand never came away, and this is at least regrettable. And when you say what President Macron has confirmed, that President Putin has assured him that there are no plans whatsoever to invade anyone, and when Madam Secretary comments on that and says that words should be backed by real actions, I have to say that this is a very interesting, very curious conversation. I have never participated in diplomatic talks that could, be rendered absolutely public, because there was nothing secret, nothing confidential, nothing based on trust. We have heard just what is proclaimed from the Tribune publicly in the UK. As far as words and actions are concerned, we always have believed that words and actions should be in tune, in sync. And that is why we draw attention to the interviews given by President Putin, the interviews given by the Foreign Ministry. They have been rendered public across the world, and all these materials demonstrate that, we were given vehement assurances that NATO would not move eastwards in the past, but then there were 5 waves of enlargement. Madam Secretary has just said that NATO is a defensive alliance, but still it has moved very close to Russian borders. Yes, NATO was a defense alliance when there was the Warsaw Treaty and when the Berlin Wall was still in existence. It was a line of defense, and everyone understands that. But right now, the wall is gone, the Warsaw Treaty is gone, and NATO decides on its own where the line is going to be, where NATO is going to serve its defense purposes. I can remind you that Jens Stoltenberg on many occasions has said that NATO has to have primary responsibility for security in the Indo-Pacific, in particular in the South China Sea. If NATO decides to use these areas as well for performing its functions, are you going to insist that each and every country has the right to choose wherever NATO is? We hear that all the time, even though we have on many occasions provided information to NATO on how they bombed Yugoslavia and Iraq under the pretext that later was called almost a fake, a mistake by Tony Blair. So the reproaches leveled at us by London as well as other Western capitals, the accusations that Russia is trying to interfere everywhere, that we are waging a cyber war, as we've heard today, these speculations abound, even in well-respected media. There is information about Russia's alleged operation to seize Kiev and the rest of Ukraine. There are allegations that Russia is preparing a coup d'etat to install a puppet regime in Kiev. It's all, from the narrative of highly likely. And I told Madam Secretary that this highly likely always stays highly likely, and nothing more than that. Let's talk about allegations against Russia with regard to Litvinenko case. No facts were produced. No facts were produced with regard to Skripal either. We do not know where they are. And his daughter, who is a Russian citizen, we have no access to her. We have not seen any facts on Navalny, even though there was a whole campaign to denigrate Russia. And the UK is playing a leading role in this campaign. We have said today that we have to build our relations based on facts. Otherwise, it's going to be propaganda, pure and simple. But unfortunately, we have not heard any facts, nor has there been any reaction to the demand we have put forth that the allegations against Russia have to be corroborated with facts. Madam Secretary has mentioned the Budapest Memorandum. Regrettably, she says that for the second time today, even though we have provided very serious explanation on that matter during the talks. The Budapest Memorandum between the US, the UK and Russia provided security guarantees to Ukraine as a non-nuclear state. Standard guarantees provided to any non-nuclear state. The Budapest Memorandum did not force either the UK, the US or Russia to recognize the anti-constitutional coup d'etat that was effected by neo-Nazis and ultra-radicals in 2013. And this Budapest Memorandum was accompanied by a declaration. And apart from the Troika, Russia, the UK and the US, this declaration was signed by Russia, Ukraine and France. And this declaration required that everyone, including Ukraine, should prevent any violations of the OSCE principles, especially the respect for the rights of national minorities. But Ukraine didn't give a damn about that.
No one is going to impose the necessity and in violation of all the Russia's obligations to recognize non-constitutional regimes and to somehow embellish the actions that discriminate the Russian-speaking population and all the other actions that happen daily in the legislative activities of Ukraine with the active support of President Zelensky. And if we are talking about Ukraine, I also reminded Madam Secretary that Zelensky and his ministers, as well as his head of the Defense and Security Council, say in public that they are not going to comply with the Minsk agreements. Foreign Minister said directly that he does not want to have any direct dialogue with Donetsk and Luhansk because there is no such dialogue stipulated by the Minsk agreements. But this is Goebbels' school. Maybe even it supersedes the art of the main propaganda man of the Third Reich, because without beating an eyelash, they pronounce these lies and they ignore what has been written by the Security Council of the UN, and they do not care about what's going on in Berlin, Paris or Washington. And this is not a very convenient position for demagogues who stand for their righteousness and try to rewrite the Minsk agreements. Unfortunately, this also fell on deaf ears of our partners, although we discussed this in detail too. Yeah, was there any other question left that we did not cover, or was it all? Excuse me, this is Sky News, but now next is Russia Today, and Sky News will be given the floor later.
Thank you.
Murad
Gadziev, Russia Today. If possible, I'm going to ask questions in English.
Two questions for you, if I may. You recently brought up Chechnya in the context of what is happening in Ukraine. You said you remember well events back then. And the question is, Britain extended extraordinary support to Chechen separatists back then. We all remember Margaret Thatcher hosting dinner for Aslan Maskhadov, who was the then president of Chechnya. You had him and his subordinates following that then launch a series of horrendous atrocities, acts of terror across Russia, hundreds dead, the theater siege, you may remember, after which the United States cut him off, saying he had lost all legitimacy. And the question is, why did Britain extend such support for Chechen separatists back then, despite the knowledge that there were thousands of Arab, foreign, Ukrainian, Georgian fighters with the Chechens? And why has Britain shown none of that engagement with separatists and rebels in eastern Ukraine? And my second question is, if I may, several years back, your boss, Boris Johnson, said that engaging with Russia diplomatically, and he mentioned Sergey Lavrov and President Putin by name, that engaging with them diplomatically was a fool's errand. Has the Prime Minister changed his mind? And are you here on what he would call a fool's errand?
The point I was making about both Chechnya and Afghanistan is the cost of war, which is immense for all sides. The point I'm making to the Russian government is that the Ukrainians will fight. And this would be a very protracted, prolonged conflict. We owe it to our populations, we owe it to European security to do all we can to avert a war in Ukraine. And that is why I'm here, to work with the Russian government, to work with our NATO allies. Russia and the United Kingdom are both permanent members of the Security Council. I believe there is a better way, and that is what I am here to seek. And the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, is very much behind those efforts.
If RT has no more questions, if you allow, I would still want to ask you, so did Boris Johnson change his opinion
about diplomatic engagement with Russia? And why hasn't Britain tried to engage the rebels and separatists in eastern Ukraine directly? Why haven't they been invited for talks in London as Chechen separatists were?
The Prime Minister is 100% behind us pursuing a diplomatic solution with our allies in NATO and others, and that's why I'm here in Moscow today, to make as much progress as we can and to work to take those discussions forward. I've been very clear about that. And, I'm not going to go into the wheres and wherefores of what's happened in the past. The situation we're in at the present is that the Minsk agreements have been agreed, but they haven't been implemented. And the first step has to be implementing the ceasefire and Russia removing its heavy weaponry from the region. That is the way we will make progress.
Highly likely.
Could we come to Diana Magnay of Sky News, please?
Thank you. Secretary, Foreign Minister Lavrov seemed to characterise your conversation just now as similar to being, if I understand it right, between a deaf and a mute. I wonder what your response to that would be. And also, you said that you were looking and hoping to encourage Russia along the path of a meaningful conversation on European security. Did you get any hint that Russia was prepared to engage on particular issues which might be meaningful? And a question for you, Foreign Minister Lavrov. This is clearly an exceptionally tense situation between nations, and de-escalation would help take the heat out of the situation. It is pretty normal to return troops to their bases after, for example, the exercises in Belarus. But are you prepared to make any meaningful gestures to de-escalate and take some of the heat out of this conversation? Out of this situation?
Well, first of all, I wasn't mute in our discussions earlier. I put forward the UK's point of view on the current situation and the fact that, as well as seeking to deter Russia from an invasion into Ukraine, we are also very resolute in pursuing the diplomatic path. And I listened to what Foreign Minister Lavrov has to say. I think there are further talks to be had. NATO has put proposals on the table to improve transparency, to improve confidence, and I want us to take those talks forward.
Что касается
As for the idea that after the military maneuvers, the troops go back to their bases, that's right. That's how it works usually. As for the time that the maneuvers takes, this is the sovereign right of each state to determine this. But unlike maneuvers that Russia holds in its own territory, when the troops go back to their bases, the troops that are far from the territory of the UK and US and as well as Canada, their troops go to the Baltic countries, for example, or countries that are on the seashore of the Black Sea. These troops and equipment usually never go back to their bases. They never go home. We also discussed this with Ms. Secretary today, and she also explained that this is not our business. As for the Russian troops doing something in the Russian territory, this is the main concern of London. And the de-escalation catchword, buzzword that you've just beautifully reiterated is the main concern of the West. And the same rationale of the political elite of the West is that you asked the question on whether Russia stands ready to show some meaningful gesture, to do something meaningful for the situation to de-escalate, to take away the heat. Well, first, you should prove that we did anything for this heat to be around, that we've been doing something to heat up the situation. Have we done something that is not part of our sovereign right, something that we can do and entitled to do in our own country? I leave this to our Western countries, all these statements on the Russian presence and Russian troops and have equipment in Ukraine. This is from the same category as highly likely statements. I already cited example of Skripal, Litvinenko, Navalny. There will be no facts presented. And for several times in a row, we've been reminding that there are no such facts, but you just ignore these statements. No one wants to hear us, probably because our rights are different, not as important as the rights of, as the UK believes, for example, UK has. So on the international arena, we have different rights. So you also mentioned maneuvers in Belarus. And Ms. Secretary stated that the main thing is to avert war in Ukraine. It's why I'm here in Moscow. But I can foresee the finale of this drama that is being played by the West, although it looks like comedy, although this is drama. So I think that very soon Western countries will come to know that the maneuvers in Belarus ended and the Russian troops are going to be back to their bases. It's when they are going to make a lot of noise to prove that the West has reached the de-escalation. Although this would be like trading air, everyone knows perfectly that once the maneuvers are over, the Russian troops are going to be back to their bases. I read in some Canadian media that the Ukrainian topic, being covered by some Canadian reporter, I'm not sure who, so this topic is an aid for the falling ratings of the Western politicians. It's a crunch in a way, so this is an interesting metaphor. So I hope that in serious matters related to the European security and security of all countries without any exceptions, be that NATO members, Russia, Ukraine. I hope that here we'll be having an adult talk and not engage in blatant propaganda, hoping to gain some electoral scores.
And the last question goes to First Channel. I've got a question to Madam Secretary. Just recently, you spoke in Australia, and you said that Ukraine weathered many invasions from the Mongols to the Tatars. I would like to ask you to clarify, has anyone else, apart from the Ukrainian people, has become more resilient after these invasions? Maybe there are other peoples that have become more resilient after these invasions of the Mongols and the Tatars.
Is that if there were to be an incursion into Ukraine, then that would not be a rapid resolution. What we would see is a prolonged conflict, which I think would be very damaging for obviously the people of Ukraine, but also the people of Russia and for European security. So at all costs, we must make sure that we avoid that, whilst but obviously maintaining the fact that Ukraine is a sovereign country that makes its own decisions about whether it joins NATO or not, and that also maintains its territorial integrity.
Спасибо.
Thank you.